You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision making. Hello, my name is Kristen Hallam, and today we are exploring our big themes for 2025. To discuss these themes, we are joined by the following experts from S&P Global Market Intelligence. Laurence, Allan, Head of Europe Insights and Analysis. Thea, Fourie, Head of Sub-Saharan Africa Insights and Analysis. Jack Kennedy, Head of Middle East North Africa Country Risk. And Eric Oak, Senior Supply Chain Analyst. It's time for the big reveal. Laurence, what are the four themes for 2025?
Hi, Kristen. I mean, when we were sat here this time last year having a similar conversation, I don't think we anticipated that 2024 would be any less volatile or dynamic. And that's exactly what we're thinking for 2025. Probably no great surprise to anyone. Some of the issues that we're looking forward to, you've already signaled: trade, conflict, different dimensions of economic growth, global role of emerging economies, and some more country-specific challenges. So we've structured our four key themes to try and help us and our clients navigate that under economic angst, domestic discontent, elusive alliances, and trade troubles. So those four pillars are the way that we're going to try and navigate the risks and opportunities over the next 12 months and think about pulling in some of the more specific issues which depend on each other and relate to each other in a dynamic fashion.
Thanks for that, Laurence. Now, how do the themes for 2025 relate to our themes for 2024? Are there common threads or perhaps hangovers, if you will?
For sure, there are common threads. If we were going to use the hangover term, then for me at least, the most obvious hangover are the consequences of the election mega cycle that we've just gone through in 2024, as some of those governments, especially new governments, put into place the policy implementation, budgetary cycles, the rest of it. The most obvious of those, although we've had India, South Africa, a bunch of other important economies go to the polls this year, but the most obvious and most recent, clearly the US. And one particular aspect of that is the still unclear position that the new Republican administration will take on Russia, Ukraine, and how that feeds into some pretty specific questions, the level of support and what that means, for example, in terms of potential for loosening sanctions in return for what sort of Russian concessions to get peace talks underway. So some very high level stuff, but some very granular specific consequences of elections in 2024 are going to shape 2025 very significantly.
I'd like to go to our other panelists to see if they have some thoughts on this 2024 versus 2025. Jack, how about you?
Thanks, Kristen. I mean, very much aligned with Laurence. We're fully expecting that geopolitical reordering and conflict is going to continue to weigh right across the international system and the effectiveness of multilateral institutions right into 2025. But where we see long-running security challenges, such as the ongoing multi-front conflict across the Middle East between Israel and Iran, it's largely focused in Lebanon and Gaza, and then the strategic need to secure key trade routes like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea, areas where the US has played a leading role through security alliances and force projection globally, and we're expecting that to continue. The war in Ukraine is also unresolved, and even with the incoming Trump administration, it's unlikely to be fully resolved quickly, and it's vulnerable to escalation, which is going to continue to create uncertainty that affects international relations and wider security strategies for the year ahead.
Right, thank you, Jack. Thea, how about you? 2024 versus 2025.
Absolutely, Kristen. So we're already seeing during the second half of this year a lot of central banks in developed economies as well as emerging markets starting to lower interest rates. And we expect that the cuts in interest rates will continue during 2025. However, there is now a risk that the interest rate cuts could be slower than initially expected, and the magnitude can be smaller. And we can get a bit more in detail about the reasoning for that. So that's the one, spillover we're seeing from 2024 into 2025.
And Eric, last but not least, 2024 versus 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. In 2024, we saw trends around the proliferation of protectionism really start to increase. We saw the increase of 301 duties by the Biden administration. We saw the EU and China start to have increasing trade tensions. We also saw several point shocks like the Suez Canal and the Red Sea being drivers of change within supply chains. So 2024 in general was about as normal as we get these days. But as we look into 2025, we're definitely anticipating an acceleration of the trends we're already seeing. So that's trade protectionism, tariffs, decoupling between the US and China, obviously increased trade tensions across the globe. Again, an acceleration of what we're already seeing.
Great. Thanks for that scene set there, everyone. Let's dig a little deeper into these themes, starting with economic angst. Thea, what are the key factors contributing to uncertainty in the global economic outlook for 2025?
Kristen, you're absolutely right. We are seeing increased global uncertainty, which is very much resulting or leading to economic angst. One of our look forward 2025 themes. And a lot of this uncertainty is around protectionism through the adoption of higher tariffs that we expect during the coming year. Because ultimately, if we do see higher tariffs compared to our baseline, it means that our inflation outlook could also be much higher than our baseline. And this has got implications for interest rates in developed economies as well as emerging markets, which of course is creating, again, a lot of uncertainty. If we, in fact, do see higher interest rates in the US, for instance, it could also mean that we probably will see a stronger US dollar compared to our current baseline. And this holds implications for a lot of other currencies globally, for emerging markets, developed economies, and frontier economies.
Thanks for that. And the possible slower monetary easing path coincides with a relatively fragile fiscal backdrop. In fact, there is very limited fiscal room to offset any negative economic shock. What implications does this hold for the global economy in 2025, Thea?
So, Kristen, yeah, the public sector debt has been accelerating quite significantly since the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the latest estimates suggest that public sector debt could reach 100 trillion US dollars or 93% of GDP by the end of this year, which is quite significant. So there's a real need to introduce fiscal consolidation to bring debt levels on a more sustainable level. However, this is all happening at a time when there's a great need for expanded fiscal spending. A lot of countries globally need to transition their economies to green economy, which is placing pressure on fiscal finances. But we're also seeing a lot of conflicts which results in the need for extra spending on defense. We've got the aging population, particularly in developed economies such as Europe, and of course also massive developmental needs in frontier and emerging markets, right, which is adding to these fiscal pressures. So very difficult conditions at the moment to really bring debt on a more sustainable level.
And are there certain countries whose debt situations are more precarious than others, Thea?
Unfortunately, Kristen, a lot of low income and frontier markets their debt backdrop is extremely vulnerable to unsustainable debt. For a lot of emerging markets and frontier markets, their debt levels as a percentage of GDP is not nearly as high as those as developed economies like the US or even emerging markets such as China. However, a large share of their government revenue is currently going towards servicing of debt levels. So this crowds out money for spending on social programs and also providing infrastructure in these economies, which is urgently needed. And also the need to bring debt on a more sustainable level. So big push towards fiscal consolidation, even for these economies. And in many instances, it means that very popular subsidies for food as well as fuel needs to be lifted. And this is happening at a time when, there's relatively high cost pressures in these economies. And also where there is a lack of confidence in governments and also a lack of trust in governments, which ultimately, in combination with this higher cost of living pressures, could spark social unrest. So, really, very problematic from that perspective.
Now, speaking of social unrest, let's pivot to the theme of domestic discontent, which is one of our four themes for next year. What are the primary factors driving domestic instability and discontent in various countries? Thea shared a little bit about the economic factors, but let's dig deeper into that.
Well, we've seen not just across the wider Middle East, North Africa region that beyond economic factors, one of the trends that we saw over the course of this year and is almost certainly going to continue into next year is protests, demonstrations, primarily related to Israel's war in Gaza, and that which is now spread across to other countries in the region. And we've seen this most clearly in those countries that have been directly impacted, so Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and the West Bank. And looking at Israel specifically, the war has exacerbated pre-existing domestic issues and criticism of the current government's leadership under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And then elsewhere, we've seen pro-Palestinian protests. They've been relatively frequent, but generally not of a scale to cause significant government destabilization. And this has also been a factor for protests outside of the Middle East and North Africa region, particularly in Western Europe, and for countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have a history of support for pro-Palestinian issues. In Europe specifically, we'd be expecting now that any further reports of large-scale civilian casualties as part of the ongoing conflict, particularly in Lebanon, would be likely to intensify protests, especially in Western Europe. We think that we're going to continue to see protests that result in the occupation of campuses by students and confrontations with police. This is very likely at European universities in France, Italy, and Greece for as long as fighting continues. And there's also an increased probability of protests by activists at European ports that are going to attempt to blockade ships that are bound for or are incoming from Israel, particularly vessels that any of those activists suspect of carrying arms.
Thank you, Jack. That's quite the picture you've painted there for us. I'd like to dig into what ways labor relations and job displacement are contributing to social unrest across different regions. Laurence, let's go to you for that.
Jack was just making reference to some of the more disruptive and violent protest tendencies that we see, and the way that we assess that is through our protest and risk scoring, which is the average score for the next 12 months. And when we look at that on a global basis, we see that 40% of all citizens across the world are in countries who we assess to have a high to severe risk of protests and riots. And a pretty significant chunk of that is related to labour directly or to labour-related issues otherwise. It's pretty clear, I think, that contentious labour relations are going to remain a focus for protests and strikes across regions through 2025. We've seen plenty of that in the second half of 2024 and through the year in Australia, in France, in Nigeria, and Brazil and Canada. So this is not a phenomenon that is restricted to any single region. Aside from that, we're also thinking about structural issues of different types in many markets, such as an aging workforce, skills gaps, and one area that is likely to drive labour unrest into social unrest, we think, is automation. And we can see one early indicator of that, if you like, in the recent US port workers' opposition to automation at US East Coast and Mexican Gulf ports. More widely, if we turn to Europe, it's pretty well known that some aspects of the green transition, which affect what we might call traditional industries, have already sparked very significant concern amongst labour unions and grassroots organisations, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, for example, in the coal industry or elsewhere in oil and gas in other parts of Europe. So we think that has the potential also to become pretty disruptive over the 2025 calendar year. So it's a very diverse, I think, as Jack also signalled, range of dynamics around that, and we're going to have to be keeping a pretty close eye on some of the indicators that will help us to get in front of that.
Thank you, Laurence. Let's keep you on the hot seat for a minute. We've seen some of these dynamics that you and Jack have talked about reflected in some election results. And over the last week or so, we've seen the challenges that coalition governments, particularly the coalition government in Germany, has faced. How are coalition governments affecting policy implementation and political stability in countries with a fragmented political landscape?
Does the political stability problem come first, or does the fragmented political landscape problem come first? And I think it's a simple equation, but it is worth saying that these coalitions reflect a deeply divided political landscape in many of these countries. We've seen over the last few days in Germany how difficult it is for a coalition government to function effectively when it is representing quite different constituencies with very different types of objectives and policy appetites. We see less extreme versions of that, but nonetheless, dynamics around coalitions in India and South Africa and in France, which effectively puts a policy break or makes more likely a policy break, policy paralysis, makes it very difficult for a sitting government to particularly implement bold reforms, which may be necessary in some cases. The German election is a great example of where subnational dynamics are a very clear indicator of the eventual direction of travel further down the line, because we've seen in Germany over the last couple of years state level elections and local elections which clearly flagged that there was a splintering of the political centre going on there, and that's exactly the point we got to in the last election, and now that's played out through the really problematic dynamics between the coalition government, which is almost certainly going to lead to early elections in Europe's largest economy. But similar dynamics are present in a number of different governments, some of which I've signalled, which came to power in 2024, and we're likely to see those challenges exacerbated as, if you like, the easy wins of the early parts of their government start to morph into the more challenging long-run policy implementation tasks that they're going to face over the next 12 months.
Now, I'd like to go back and touch on one of those 2024 hangovers, if you will, that we talked about earlier, which is how do electoral outcomes from the 2024 mega cycle of elections influence political alliances and policy making in 2025? And Laurence, let's start with you. And then Jack, I'd like you to come in and share your thoughts on this as well.
Already indicated a couple of the potential implications for the Russia-Ukraine conflict of the shift of government in the US and what that means, for example, for the NATO alliance and for US government relations with its European partners. We also had during 2024, it's kind of been a bit forgotten about now because so much has happened in the interim period, that we had elections to the European Parliament in the middle of the year and the subsequent nomination of Ursula von der Leyen for another term as effectively president of the EU. And what's come out of that, interestingly, is a really increased focus on global competitiveness. So we've got obviously the different member states and the different institutions of the EU, effectively all of which are coalitions, but nonetheless the EU itself has really positioned this global competitiveness agenda very strongly as its policy guideline for the next 5 years. And that's going to have pretty significant implications for its relations internally, but also with every other region. And of course, runs alongside the ongoing EU argument with China over subsidies for EV batteries. And then we've also seen in a European context, German instability I've already referred to, likewise for France. And if we look a little bit more widely to another very important economy, the playing out of this different dynamics in India after the elections mid-year there, which saw Prime Minister Modi's complete control of the political scene there diluted somewhat, and we're yet to see some of the implications of that play out in the way that India is engaged internationally. We think it's going to lead to a slightly greater focus on its far abroad, if you like, where some of the internal political dynamics for India are not quite as sensitive as in their immediate neighbours.
I also want to focus on maybe the last of this mega cycle of elections, the US one, and maybe put that lens and that focus onto the Middle East region. I mean, while we're expecting that the incoming Trump administration is likely to pursue a relatively independent approach to foreign affairs, one that's relatively more averse to foreign US military deployments and US engagements with multinational organizations, is still likely to be heavily committed to security and economic interests in the Middle East, guaranteeing Israel's security as well as freedom of navigation, particularly for key maritime choke points and trade routes, particularly those that ensure unimpeded flow of oil, are likely to remain core priorities for the US foreign policy in the Middle East region. So under a Trump presidency, we're expecting US diplomacy to probably be focused on preventing a wider regional escalation involving Iran and the Arab Gulf states and securing ceasefires in Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the intention of facilitating normalization eventually between Israel and between Saudi Arabia. But nevertheless, we expect that the overall success of these measures is probably going to be constrained by the second Trump presidency being willing to impose relatively fewer constraints over Israel and its decision making.
Right. Thank you, Laurence and Jack. This seems like a good time to pivot to the theme of elusive alliances. Jack, let's stay with you. How are geopolitical dynamics influencing the formation and fluidity of international alliances in 2025?
Quite significantly, I mean, in a conflicted and increasingly competitive world, especially when we look at economic and geopolitical systems, countries are going to look towards pragmatic decision making in their relationships with each other to kind of square their tactical needs with strategic interests in a rapidly evolving global environment. And we look at blocks like BRICS or the G20, we expect these kind of fault lines to prompt wider dialogues amongst countries where cooperation and where compromise are mutually beneficial, with no single principle really forming the basis for wider multi-alignment.
And Jack, in what ways are emerging markets leveraging their influence to reshape global institutions and frameworks in this environment?
Well, to take, say, the latest BRICS summit held in Russia this last October, for example, what we see is that emerging markets and countries and governments are clearly showing an increased interest in joining things like the BRICS government. And we had 20 heads of state that were present from a total of 36 countries sending delegations. But on a wider level, kind of acceptance here remains subject to bilateral considerations. So with BRICS, drivers for membership include issues like increasing intent to develop alternative frameworks for trade, wider security, political cooperation, and then differences with advanced economies. So we see misalignments over the imposition of barriers to trade, and these are definitely likely to increase, encouraging economic cooperation between BRICS members, but also in divergences over things like international sanctions, climate finance, trade barriers, and the UN-led model for interstate conflict resolution. And this is likely to continue to have an influence over wider attempts at de-dollarization as we look at it. So local currency usage in financial transactions and trade remains a key BRICS objective. And we expect that political alignment and geographic proximity are going to encourage more trade and financial transactions to be conducted in local currencies going forward. But despite these kind of efforts, it's really important to flag here that we're still seeing relatively few indicators at this stage of a significant challenge to the US dollar's leading role in international trade.
Thank you, Jack. Thea, any additional thoughts on that question from an economic perspective?
Can just maybe focus on one aspect and just repeat basically what he said, and it's about climate financing and the vulnerability of emerging markets and frontier markets to climate change. And like Jack said, in some instances, you definitely will see developed economies and smaller economies collaborate to address some of these economic challenges like climate change on platforms like COP or the G20. But then in other instances, you will see that there's increased competition to come ahead or be the leaders in green energy technology, for instance, in electric vehicles. So you constantly will have this balancing between collaboration against competition. And I think Jack highlighted that also very clearly.
One more question for you, Thea, on this theme. What challenges do developing markets face in advancing their national interests within this fragmented geopolitical landscape that Laurence and Jack have described?
Kristen, yeah, that is really complicated. I think, first of all, national interest of developed economies and frontier markets is quite different in some instances from developed economies. And that's not unique. That's been the situation for many years. But again, looking at climate finance, it's very difficult for the smaller economies and developing economies to address or make headway in addressing these national challenges. Let's look at climate finance. There's the urgent need to secure financing that will allow economies to become more robust against climate events. We need to mobilize global financing. And in this fragmented world, it's very difficult to achieve this, right? Meaning that these economies will remain vulnerable to climate events, social conditions and poverty can actually worsen, and it's got massive implications for migration to developed economies. So really a difficult landscape to navigate at this stage.
And with that, I think we'll pivot to our trade troubles theme. So, Eric, how are increasing tariffs and export restrictions reshaping global trade dynamics in 2025?
That's a great question, and the answer obviously is very very long and nuanced. So I'll try to spare you the nitty gritty details. But generally, we're seeing a kind of a bipolar world emerging, a decoupling between the U.S. and China, as well as again trade tensions between the EU and China as well. So how tariffs will start to change the landscape is generally by increasing protectionism. It'll increase barriers and increase costs for multinationals. Generally, the kind of countries or economies on the margins are going to face the largest negative impacts. So obviously, trade with African or South American countries, with the US, if there's a general broad 20% tariff on all imports, that's going to impact those countries at the margins the most. Generally, again, tariffs are, again, a tax on imports. So there are various economic and trade considerations that will kind of influence companies' decisions to move sourcing. We've already seen these trends in general since 2016 and the first Trump administration, where companies have been moving away from China as a general rule, mostly because of underlying factors around labor costs and kind of manufacturing locations as more labor-oriented manufacturing shifts to lower cost areas. But obviously, the original US China trade war kind of accelerated and pushed those transitions forward on a much faster pace. We do expect that to continue at a faster pace. New tariffs in 2025 could come in really as early as day one or week one if the administration is motivated to do so. USTR is incoming from the last administration, so Lighthizer will be ready. And they know the path, they know the way to do this. So obviously, you can only plan for what's been said so far. The details may be obviously vastly different. But then as the administration gets its feet under it, we do expect that they're going to, if they deliver on some of those promises, again, the 20% broad tariff, 60% on things from China, initiatives like that, we do expect those to happen fairly quickly if the administration is motivated to do that.
Thank you, Eric. You've touched on this, but I just want to dig a little deeper on it. In what ways might the outcome of the US elections influence future trade policies and relationships with
Yeah.
states that are trying to navigate a middle road on strategic competition between the US and China?
Yeah, it's certainly a tough situation for again, yeah, countries that are caught in the middle. Generally, what we've seen, again, we already have the playbook for 2025 if you look at 2018 essentially. But what we're generally going to anticipate is a more transactional, more goods focused US trade policy. There's going to be a lot of concern for US agricultural exports, things like that. So generally, countries are going to have to navigate this more transactional style of international trade relations with the Trump administration versus the more, again, WTO focused multilateral discussions that are more the kind of foray of the current administration. There's definitely going to be some impacts. Obviously, we've seen things like the spread of solar tariffs, CBA tariffs on solar panels that have spread, from China to, Vietnam, Thailand, et cetera, because of the shift in trade. So trade itself, logistics, the movement of goods will almost always find a way to minimize their own costs. And so that will obviously continue under the new administration, but definitely be prepared for a more reactionary effort to shore up those new avenues when they do appear.
Trade finds a way. All right. Jack, any additional geopolitical context to provide there to what Eric said?
Fully in agreement. We're expecting that strategic competition between the US and mainland China is going to increase in scope with the Trump presidency, and obviously that's going to impact wider trade policy and industrial practices. And just to focus again on the Middle East region, we expect that the US is going to continue to contest the influence of China in investment and partnership, particularly in high tech and security sectors. And this is going to be really apparent for Gulf monarchies in particular. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have outlined economic development targets to expand their technology sectors via investments in semiconductors and AI capabilities. And Trump presidency's probably going to continue with Biden-era restrictions around AI accelerator chips and related servers, as well as semiconductor manufacturing technologies and supply chains, but also increase the restrictions around the use of China-sourced hardware. So for the US, export of its high-end graphics processors to Gulf states is likely to be subject to restrictions that limit involvement with Chinese firms, and new data centers are likely to be required to be physically locked down and constructed with hardware that's sourced exclusively from the US to avoid potential security breaches. And this is the kind of practice that we can see becoming more and more common. We're looking ahead.
Thank you, Jack. And Laurence, what about you? Any additional geopolitical context to provide here?
A couple of things quickly. Firstly, we've not yet mentioned Latin America today. Our Latin America team has produced some analysis of the consequences for that region of the US elections, potentially. Their themes for key themes for 2025 for that region. And obviously for Latin America, US elections are always extremely nerve-wracking. This time around's no difference. I think if I was sitting on the Latin America desk, the two things I'd be flagging immediately would be the US focus on immigration for labour reasons and other things, and secondly, the fact that the USMCA is going to be in the process of potential renegotiation pretty soon, and so a change of government in the US following on fairly quickly from a change of government in Mexico is something for an eye to be kept on. From a European perspective, I think that key kind of high level framing for these issues is really where the EU is stuck between the US and China. I mean, it's been in that position, fairly uncomfortable position for quite a long time now. We've heard for 3 or 4 years at least from the mouth of President Macron lots of bold talk about Europe's strategic autonomy. I don't think he's convincing anyone with that in practice, and we can see that the challenges here are pretty significant for the EU. It's already in a, at the moment, relatively low key and few sectors of trade dispute with China, as I mentioned earlier on, focused on EVs. On the other hand, during the last Trump administration, trade dispute between the EU and the US was pretty uncomfortable. Ended up, of course, with tariffs on EU steel and aluminium going to the US market, and with EU countermeasures. Those were suspended when the Biden administration took office, but are still there on the books and need to be reviewed by March 2025. So we'll be looking at that as one of the early, really strong indicators as the direction of travel for EU-US trade relations. And likewise, the EU investigations of Chinese alleged subsidies is not yet fully completed. So we're going to be looking at that pretty closely towards the end of the year to see what signals are coming out of Brussels on that and how that might develop.
Lots of moving parts there.
Hey, Kristen, I think another bellwether might be the East Coast strike in the US.
Yes.
So I think that's one thing to obviously keep another kind of early eye on. The strike was postponed, essentially. They settled the wage issue, but now they have the automation issue coming up. That's going to be January 15th, and that'll be a very early indication of, I think, probably how 2025 will go in general. Obviously, that's in the last days of the Biden administration, and we just don't know what they're going to do, if they're going to invoke any sort of executive policy to stop the strike or not, or just leave it to the Trump administration to deal with there. But that could be another very early impactor to EU and US trade if essentially the East Coast ports are shut down. It is during an off period in general for global trade. Obviously, it's coinciding roughly with the Lunar New Year holidays and things like that, where global trade generally is in a trough. But the East Coast and the transatlantic trade generally don't see as much of that seasonality as the West Coast of the US and other kind of seasonal markets. So there definitely could be some impact. We are expecting companies to early ship anything that they want to get in before that.
Yeah, good point, Eric. Eric, let's stay with you. So how do these geopolitical risks and the protectionism that you and Laurence and Jack have described, how do those impact business investment and global supply chains?
Yeah, it's a great question. Generally, business investment is on longer cycles than month to month or year to year, especially when we think about the different types of shoring. So that's, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, any type of definition. And those are obviously all nebulous and up for debate of what you want to call each one. But generally, companies are going to be interested in securing a base of supply that offers them the lowest cost for their goods. So that's going to change over time. So again, I mentioned the prior trends of more labor-denominated industries away from China and towards more Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. That will generally be accelerated by geopolitical trends, tariffs, etc. If you see tariffs applied to some of those countries that are seeing large trade deficits with the US grow over the last few years, then obviously that'll change the calculus for businesses looking to invest in those countries. Whether there's another option that gives them the same or lower costs remains to be seen. It's really industry dependent. So obviously an industry like apparel has very different options than high-end semiconductors for where they can source their goods from. But you will see generally a little bit more nuance and thought being put into some of those sourcing decisions as, again, tariffs increase, the potential for tariffs increase, those risks do go up. You'll probably be seeing a bit more of a conservative approach to sourcing and moving your goods around the world. We generally have seen that trend, the conservative trend, fall back away after 2021, 2022, where there was really concerns about supply. And we have seen companies moving back towards a just-in-time, a kind of accelerated low-cost trade strategy. And obviously tariffs throw a wrench at that if the company's goods are specifically targeted by a new tariff. We can't predict the specifics, obviously, but it's definitely something that the companies need to consider and build into their risk and investment strategies.
Right. Thanks for that, Eric. And Jack, just following on quickly from what Eric was telling us, can you share our outlook for the Houthi disruption of shipping in the Red Sea? What do we anticipate there?
Well, we think that Houthi targeting of commercial and naval vessels is almost certainly going to continue into 2025. This is despite US-led coalition airstrikes on Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen. And because of that, we're maintaining a severe risk for all vessels and crew that are attempting to transit the Bab el-Mandeb Strait into the Red Sea from the Gulf of Aden, and that's regardless of ship affiliation. The Houthi continue to claim that their attacks on shipping are due to Israel's combat operations in Gaza and Lebanon, and they've linked attacks on Israeli territory with other Iran-aligned militia groups right across the region. Now, we think that's a deliberate misrepresentation of their true aims, which is to secure international recognition of their position in Yemen and ultimately to secure a role as a meaningful regional geopolitical actor. So we don't see an indication at this point that the level of the attacks that they're carrying out is going to recede in any way.
Thanks for that, Jack. And Eric, one last question for you. You kind of touched on this earlier, but considering all of the geopolitical risk that we have talked about, which regions or countries do you think could emerge as key players in global trade in 2025?
The key players are the ones you already know. There's not many surprises, I would say, within global trade in 2025. Obviously, there could be surprises. Don't get me wrong there, but we can't predict those point shocks. But generally, you're going to see, obviously, China, the US, the EU. Those are kind of the three main blocks. We're going to continue to see tensions with, obviously, the Russian war in Ukraine. We're going to continue to see tensions with Iran. So that's going to be the US sanctions regime targeting those countries and the trade with those countries. That's going to create, again, as we mentioned, a little bit of a bipolar world where trade within those blocks is going to be separate from the global trade with the US specifically. Definitely, Southeast Asian countries are going to be a key player. Again, we've seen this trend of goods manufacturing moving from China to Southeast Asian countries. Those countries have their own tensions with China, with the US, with other countries within their regions. Again, everyone's their own player, essentially, but we do see that block definitely being important for especially US trade moving forward. And then again, we do see things like Saudi Arabia, some of those Middle Eastern countries, as Jack mentioned, trying to develop and grow their own position within global trade. And they do sit in a key place, kind of geographically for trades. That is important. And if plans go forward for things like a land route between the UAE and Dubai and et cetera, down towards the Mediterranean, obviously, it's obviously very contingent on tensions in the region, but there are plans to create additional links across those regions that could be beneficial for those economies.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to Laurence, Thea, Jack, and Eric. And thanks to you for engaging with us. Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.